think we're good on the recording part. Okay. I guess we can get started. So thank you, David, for hosting this event with us tonight. For anybody out in the audience, David Jurman is a Guttenberg resident and lifelong baseball fan, and he saw Roy White play in person several times. You're a New York Yankees fan, and you've seen him play at the stadium. You went on the road to Boston, Baltimore, Detroit, Milwaukee, Chicago, Arlington, Anaheim, and Oakland. So please enjoy the fascinating life of Roy White.
Jane, thank you so much. I also want to say thank you, Chelsea, at the North Bergen Public Library for having us. And it's my pleasure to be interviewing tonight Paul Semendinger. Paul is the co-author of the autobiography of the Yankee great Roy White. So without further ado, let's get into our questions here. And I first off want to just ask, before we get into talking about Roy, Paul, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself. I know you have an extensive background in the field of education, as well as being someone who's a baseball historian. If you could just tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Oh, sure. Thank you. And thank you to everyone for inviting me to this wonderful program. My name is Paul Semendinger. I'm a retired school principal. I was a principal in Ridgewood for the last 14 years of my career before I retired last year. I was also principal in Montvale, vice principal in Pompton Lakes, and I was a teacher, history teacher in Fair Lawn. I still work as an adjunct professor at Ramapo College, and I'm an author. And my most recent book is From Compton to the Bronx, which is the autobiography of the great Yankee Roy White. But if you see, it's really his book. It's Roy White. And on the bottom, it says, with Paul Semendinger. It's Roy's story. I wrote it, but it's Roy's story.
So tell us, how did your Yankees fandom come about?
How did my Yankees fandom come about? That's a great story. I love telling this story because it is one of my favorites. I was a little boy. I was about 9 years old, and I started watching baseball. This was the summer of 1977, and I became a big Yankees fan. At that time, the Yankees were no different to me than the other types of interests I had, which was probably superheroes and comic books, and they were all larger than life. And I really didn't see any difference between the Yankees and Superman and Batman and Aquaman. Again, they were all bigger than life. They were all superheroes. But the day that it was solidified that I became a Yankee fan forever was on the night Reggie Jackson hit those 3 home runs in the 1977 World Series. My mom and dad were both teachers. And that night, my dad actually had back to school night. And I was watching the World Series with my mom. And I was 9. And my dad came home, and it was late. It was a school night. And he said to my mom, well, Paul, you better go to sleep. It's a school night. And my mom, let me just take one step backwards. There's probably not a bigger baseball fan in the world than my dad. So it's probably eating him up to have to put me to bed. But he was trying to do the right thing as a dad and as a parent. But anyway, my mom said, oh, let's let him stay up. The Yankees are going to win the World Series. Reggie hit the 3rd home run. The Yankees win the World Series. And as they're jumping around on the field, little bits of water are falling out of my eyes. And I'm crying, and I couldn't understand it because at that point in my life, I'd never heard of tears of joy, and I associated crying with sadness. But I'll never forget that because it was a totally different emotion. I was so happy. And I like to say, if you remember that movie, Jerry Maguire, when the girl comes in and she said, "You had me at hello." Well, the Yankees had me for good at that point. They had me at Reggie.
That's a great story. That's fantastic. Now, fast forward many years later, and here you are, this great Yankee fan, and now you're working on the autobiography of Roy White, one of the most beloved Yankees from the 60s on. And Roy had other people approach him to do his autobiography. You weren't the first one. And he passed on all of those people. He declined that. But when you two got together, there was a chemistry there, it worked out. Why did he choose you, and how did it all come about?
So that's a long story. So I will make it as short as I possibly can. I've always been a writer. Even when I was working full time, I was writing, and I was struggling, as all writers do, to get published. And the long story is, after many attempts and going to many writing conferences and talking with other authors, literary agents, etc., it was told to me that you need to have a platform. I didn't have a platform. So I started writing for a Yankee site called It's About the Money. And that started to give me a platform because people then saw that I could write about the Yankees and that I had some knowledge. About 6 months into my writing gig with that Yankee site, they decided not to have a site anymore. They said, "We're going to shut this thing down." And I was like, "No, you can't. This was my one outlet. I'm on the internet. People are reading me. People know who I am." And so this was my Andrew Carnegie moment. I said, if you're going to shut it down, rather than firing me, can I buy the company? And they're like, "Yeah, you could have it." And so it wasn't really Andrew Carnegie. They gave it to me for free. They only said you have to change the name. And so I changed it to Start Spreading the News. That was in 2017, October. It's actually like the 1 year and 1 day anniversary of Start Spreading the News. It started on October 23rd of 2017. And anyway, that became my outlet. And we put out 4 or 5 articles every single day. We've been doing it nonstop since that first day when we were there. And, millions of people have watched and read Start Spreading the News. And that helped me secure a book deal for my first novel, Scattering the Ashes. And once I had a novel, I started getting on podcasts and things like that. And then I wrote a book about the Yankees called The Least Among Them, which talks about the 29 Yankees whose entire career lasted for just 1 day. And that got me on more sports podcasts. And that led to an opportunity with the Northeast Streaming Sports Network to do my own podcast. And so I was doing that, and Mac McGrath, the man who runs that whole network and is the host of the Mac and Jack show, through a connection was able to reach out and get a connection with Roy White. Holy cow. He said to me, "Hey, Paul, how would you like to be the person who interviews Roy White on the podcast?" I'm like, "Yes, absolutely." And we had a date set up, and at the last minute, it had to be changed. It had to be canceled. And so the rescheduled day was like on a Thursday of the next week. I was still an active school principal. My job came first, obviously, and I had a school event. So I said to Mac, "I can't do it, but could you do me a quick favor and just ask Roy White, tell him I'm a published author, tell him that I only do nice things. I'm not out to create controversy or anything like that, and I would love to write his autobiography." The next day, I get a text from Mac, and it's Roy White's phone number. And as I like to say, if that's where the story ended, I would have been thrilled. I would have said to people, "I have Roy White's phone number." That would have been pretty cool for me because that's the closest I would have ever come to having a connection with a Major League Baseball player. But anyway, I texted Roy White. I didn't have the guts to call him out of the blue. And he said, "I'll get back to you." About a month later, we still hadn't ever really connected. It was now Christmas time of 2021, I believe. And it was also Roy White's birthday. I texted him again, said, "You'd said we could talk about the idea." I was driving home from work because principals work over the holidays, and Roy White called me. And I told him what my idea was. I wanted to write his autobiography. I had understood that Yankee writers and big time sports writers had wanted to do that. But the impression I always got was they wanted Roy White to write the book that Roy White didn't want to write, which was telling the secrets of Mickey Mantle and Billy and Reggie and Thurman Munson, and spilling all those secrets that no one else has ever told, like so many other players have done. And Roy White's a classy individual. He would never do that. So I said to him, "We will write your book. Every word in that story will be approved by you. I won't print anything that you don't agree with. If it's in the book, you have the final say." And he said, let me think about it. And about a day or two later, I got a text and it basically said, yes, let's do it. And from there, we started writing the book. That's how it all came to be.
Now, I was at a book launch event that the two of you were at, and
Yes.
you talked about you had a secret meeting place where you met to discuss the book. Now the book is out, we can reveal that secret meeting place. Could you talk about that?
Yes. So when we started, Roy White obviously didn't know me, and I didn't know him, except I knew of him because he's Roy White. So we started doing it by Google Meet. The technology wasn't great and all that kind of stuff. And then I guess maybe for our third or fourth meeting, he said, why don't we do this in person? And his suggestion originally was the food court at Paramus Park Mall. And I thought, like, that's crazy. Everybody's just going to bother us because you're Roy White. Nobody would bother me in the food court, but they'll bother you. But the day we came up with was a Sunday. And of course, Paramus Park is closed. So I said, there are other meeting places. By then I knew where he lived. And I knew there were some eateries in Ramsey, New Jersey. And I suggested a number of them. And he said, Panera Bread sounds great. So we met at the Panera Bread at the Ramsey Square. And that's where we wrote the book. We met there probably once or twice a month for about 8 months on a Saturday or a Sunday. And we would just pull up a chair at one of the tables and I'd bring my computer and he would tell stories. And that's how I wrote the book.
Thank you, Panera Bread.
Thank you, Panera Bread. Absolutely.
So, folks, this book has gotten just rave reviews. And what's really special is the advanced reviews that you got from noteworthy baseball historians. Can you talk about that?
Oh, I have been honored when I've written these books that other writers, big time writers, have welcomed me into their fold, if you will, right, into their world. They had no reason to, even when I wrote the first one, to ever recognize this nobody, Paul Semendinger. But I sent them nicely worded requests and said, hey, I have this Yankee book. Would you be interested in looking at it? And almost to a person, all of these writers, rather than like ignoring me or saying like he's our competition, they've all welcomed it. And so I've had the opportunity to meet Marty Appel. And, I reached out to him and I said, it would be really great if you would write the foreword to the book. And he, of course, well, maybe not of course, but he agreed. He said, I would love to do that. He's a big fan of Roy White. And, I sent him the transcript of the book. I sent him the rough draft and all that so that he could see obviously what he was reading and see if he agreed with how it was written and the quality. And I do that always. If somebody says they're going to write a review, I send them the book, obviously, and so they can read the book, so they can write a legitimate review. And yeah, it's quite something when big time writers and people who are in the know and who've covered Roy White and who have big time followings take the time to read my work. And even greater when they say, you've done good, kid. That really is, there's really nothing that equals that.
How long did it take to write the book?
You'd be surprised. Usually people say it takes years to write books, and it does. But this book, we basically wrote it over, I'd say 8 months. By the end of August of 2022, we started in January, the book was basically written.
Now, tell our viewers who don't know, who is Marty Appel? He's certainly a major figure in Yankeedom, but I'm sure a lot of people don't know who Marty Appel is.
All right, so Marty Appel is widely considered the greatest Yankee living historian there is. He was the Yankee PR director for, an untold amount of time. He is the man who organized Old Timers Day for, again, many, many years. He was the executive producer of the WPIX Yankee broadcasts for a super long time. And he's written numerous books. I mean, I couldn't even count them, including probably the most comprehensive history of the Yankees, a big, thick book titled Pinstripe Empire. He also wrote Thurman Munson's autobiography and Ron Blomberg. He wrote a book with, and so many, like on and on and on. He is widely considered the authority, the modern authority on the Yankees. And if you ever watch like a Yankeeography or any documentary on the Yankees, invariably one of the people talking in that biography or that show is Marty Appel, because he is the guy in the know.
So let's get into Roy White and his life story. The subtitle of the book is called From Compton to the Bronx. Many people, when you say Compton, they think of hip hop. It was the place where a lot of the LA West Coast rappers came out of, the Compton area. But in the case of Roy White, this is where he came from. So let's go back to those times of his childhood and growing up in Compton.
Yeah, Compton was not a safe place back then. It was an inner city right next to Watts, which has a reputation for being a very dangerous part of LA as well. And Roy White grew up in poverty. He had a mixed, his parents were of mixed race, and this is in the 1940s. So you can imagine how difficult that was. And unfortunately, that marriage didn't last, though he did stay connected with his mother and his father, though he lived with his mother. But, you know, they were on public assistance. And there were times in his life where there were very scary things that happened in and around him in neighborhoods. One such story was sort of an ironic story. He and his friends were walking. They were walking, I guess, home or to a party or to a gathering somewhere. And a car full of thugs, if you will, bad kids, pulled up next to them. And they knew they were in trouble because those bad kids came out of the car with things like tire irons and chains. And they were going to beat them all up, he and his friends. And they scattered, because that's what you would obviously do in a situation like that. And Roy White ran across the Little League field. And I guess it was evening or it was almost dark and there was dew on the ground, or the grass, maybe it had just rained. And he slipped on the grass in the outfield and fell and laid there and really assumed that the people were following him and they were going to beat him and really hurt him. But for whatever reason, they didn't follow him. And years later, when he was playing left field on the Yankees, for the Yankees at Yankee Stadium, he sort of remembered that moment and thought, like, wow, here I am playing left field in Yankee Stadium. When I was a kid, there was a point in time when I thought I was really going to get beat up in left field on my Little League field. So it was a tough childhood for him. You know, that he had one pair of shoes. It was definitely, there was baseball was a big part of it. He had a lot of great friends. They did a lot of playing of baseball. He took his studies seriously as he got older and did really well in school, which helped prevent him from getting into trouble at a certain point. I won't spoil that story from the book. But Roy White is one of the things that really struck me. Two things, really. The first thing is when we meet our heroes, and again, I began by saying Roy White was like a superhero to me. He was a Yankee and he was bigger than life and still is. But a lot of times when you meet your heroes, they have clay feet, right? They let you down. They're not quite what you thought they were. And the reputation Roy White always had before I ever met him was he was the classy Yankee, the good guy, a decent, wonderful human being. And the beautiful thing is when I met him and worked with him and still talk with him, all of that's still true. He is a gentle, kind, decent, wonderful human being. So there was no clay feet dealing with Roy White. There was just being in the presence of a great person. And again, that's why he didn't want to write a book that said bad things about other players, because that's not who he was. So I forget what the other point I was going to make as I was talking about what a good person he is. But oh, I know. He's also not the type of person that lets situations in life that are beyond his control define him. So some people could say you grew up in poverty, that gives you an excuse to, you know, not succeed or whatever. He never looked at things that way. He rose above the challenges that life presented, obviously, to become a professional baseball player, a New York Yankee and world champion, and etc.
Now, he grew up at the time where the Dodgers went from Brooklyn to Los Angeles. The Angels came into being in 1961. But was he a Yankee fan growing up?
Roy White was the fan of the Cincinnati Reds. That was his favorite team. And the other team he liked were the Cleveland Indians. He liked the Reds and the Indians, I guess, because of the colors. He liked the way their uniforms looked. He also liked the Reds because, they had big Ted Kluszewski with the big arms and the cutoff shirts and things like that. But yeah, so his favorite teams growing up were the Indians and the Reds. He was not a Yankee fan.
Now, he had a very productive career in the minor leagues that brought him to the Yankees pretty quickly, considering the time frame of players going to the major leagues at that time. The Yankees had arguably the greatest run in the history of American sport from 1920, when Babe Ruth joined the team, up until 1964. It's staggering to think they only had one losing season during that time frame in 1925. And that run finally ended in 1964 when they lost in 7 games to St. Louis Cardinals in the World Series. Roy White, unfortunately, joins the Yankees in 1965, and that is a losing season for the Yankees. He was one of the bright lights of the Yankees in the 1960s. But could you talk a little bit about Roy and when he came to the Yankees and his first 5 years in those late 60s playing for the Bronx Bombers?
Yes. So, right. One of the things was Roy White was not known as a power hitter. And when he signed with the Yankees, some of the other kids that he grew up with in his neighborhood, those kids were getting, a lot of those guys got professional, or a number of them got professional contracts for tens of thousands of dollars. I think Roy White's first professional contract was for like $3,000 or $4,000. It wasn't a lot. But when he talked with his baseball coach about that, the baseball coach said, yeah, but you're going to sign with the New York Yankees. You're going to make lots of extra money because they're always in the World Series. So he had this expectation, as anyone would when you sign with the Yankees, that you're going to be in the World Series and there's going to be things to supplement your income. But that did not happen. By the time he got to the Yankees, as you said, in 1965, the dynasty had come to a crashing halt. Roy White was a very good baseball player, but the Yankees didn't have any great baseball players, and a lot of the players around him just never panned out at the same time. The young players didn't pan out at the same time why the big time players like Whitey Ford, Bobby Richardson, Mickey Mantle, Tony Kubek, on, they were really at the ends of their careers or retiring. And so the Yankees were just in this morass, right? And it shocked everybody. And it was a difficult time to play Major League Baseball as a Yankee. But of course, for Roy White, it was the beginning of his career. And that was all very exciting. And even though he wasn't a home run hitter, he was the best hitter they had. And so the Yankees actually batted him 4th in the lineup because he was the best guy on the team to protect Mickey Mantle. So how cool is that? You make it to the Yankees and you become the guy who protects Mantle in the lineup.
He had, although the team didn't have winning seasons except in 1968 in that second half of the 60s, he had productive years.
Yeah, he did. He was an all-star twice once the 1970s roll around. And, Thurman Munson then comes onto the scene in 1970, wins the Rookie of the Year. Bobby Mercer starts to emerge. He had missed some time, obviously, or maybe not obviously, but he had missed some time early in his career for military service. Roy White missed some time for military service, but he was in the reserves and you were able to do that on weekends and things like that. Or you just leave your team for a couple of days, serve your reserve time, and then get back to your team. But the Yankees started to emerge, obviously, and Roy White was one of the stars of the Yankees in the late 60s, obviously, and into the early 70s. And, he was a switch hitter. He was an adept outfielder. He could do all the things. People say, including Bill James, the great baseball statistician and one of the great minds who look at statistics and numbers and players and compares them across different eras, he has made the claim that Roy White's career actually trumps that of Hall of Famer Jim Rice. But the difference between Rice's numbers, batting average and RBIs and home runs and things like that, are things that everybody at the time really noticed. The statistics that Roy White accumulated were things like on base percentage and hitting behind the runner and taking the extra base and stealing bases and making good plays in the field and helping your team win in any number of different ways. And those things just weren't as noticed and is calculated back then. But he said in today's day, Roy White would be even a much more valued player because he really did everything well.
You're so right. 1970 was a pivotal turnaround year for the Yankees. They won over 90 games that season. Baltimore had an incredible season and ran away with the division, winning well over 100 games. So fortunately, we're in the pennant race. But they did, as I mentioned, win over 90 games. And until they had that spell of losing from 1989 to 92, the Yankees started with 1970, only had one losing season all the way through 1988, and that was 1982. And one constant about those 70s Yankee teams that started that great run was Roy White. And what was pretty special about Roy was we knew that he could run. We knew he could hit for average. As you say, wasn't a power hitter, but he could hit the occasional home run. But what was really remarkable was he was the first ever Yankee in the 1971 season to go an entire year without making an error, which is just simply amazing. Can you talk about that 71 season with Roy defensively?
Yeah, I think you said it all. He didn't make an error. And no Yankee, think about that, had ever done that before. Roy White was the type of player who took pride in every aspect of his game. He didn't just say, I'm going to hit well. He didn't just say, I'm going to field well. He didn't just say, I'm going to run well. He said, I want to be a complete ball player. And he worked very hard for that. And of course, it was not easy playing left field in Yankee Stadium in those days. The way the sun came up over left field, it was blinding out there. It was considered one of the toughest sun fields in baseball. But he, through a lot of practice, learned how to manage to play with the sun. And I think it was Tom Tresh who gave him some advice as how to play your best outfield. Because interestingly enough, Roy White came up as an infielder. He came up as a second baseman. And for a very brief time in 1967, the Yankees they didn't really trade him, but they loaned him to the Los Angeles Dodgers. And the Dodgers at the time tried to make him into a third baseman. And then he came back to the Yankees trying to play third base. And it wasn't until like 1968 that he moved to the outfield permanently, which is really where he really found his home. But that took a lot of work for him to become such an adept outfielder. And then the results paid off, obviously, when he made no errors.
Talk about Roy being a classy player. And what I remember when I used to go see him play games was nowadays you see a player get a double and they're fist pumping and pounding their chest and pointing at the dugout. Roy always, even when he hit a home run, there was none of the histrionics whatsoever. If he made a great play defensively, he wasn't jumping up and down. He was smooth. He played with class out there. Your thoughts about that?
Yes. So I'm going to go back to when I was 9. And, when you're 9, what you see is how you define the world, obviously, right? That all of us do that. Even today, like if something happens, we sort of take in what's around us, and that becomes our first initial understanding of whatever it is. And then as we get other experiences, we can say that's good, bad, or indifferent, or whatever. But think about the Yankees in 1977. When I'm 9, it was chaotic. They were on the back page all the time. Reggie was arguing with Billy. Billy was arguing with Reggie. Thurman was arguing with Reggie. And it was chaotic. And Greg Nettles, I think, had the great quote. I think that came in 78. But he said, when I was a kid, I wanted to grow up and join the circus or play with the Yankees or play Major League Baseball. And with the Yankees, I've had the chance to do both. And Sparky Lyle wrote his book and called it the Bronx Zoo because it was a zoo. It was chaotic. And George Steinbrenner was a big part of all that as well. And firing and hiring people and players in and out. It was chaos. And I remember my dad getting me a baseball magazine to read probably that summer. And, it was one of those like Baseball Weekly, but it wasn't called that at the time. They always had things on the newsstand, baseball magazines. And I remember coming across a word that I'd never seen in print before. And it was the word damn, D-A-M-N. And I was mortified because I was like, what does that mean? Demon. And I asked my parents, like, ooh, that's a naughty word. You shouldn't be reading that word in this magazine. I can't believe it's published. But the whole thing was about the strife and the arguing around the Yankees. And I grew up with that being my definition of what Major League Baseball players are like. It's chaotic. Everybody hates each other. As I look back as an adult, I think one reason the Yankees were so successful in those late 70s years wasn't necessarily that they had so many great players like Reggie and Nettles and Roy White and Thurman and Lou Piniella and Sparky Lyle and Ron Guidry, et cetera, but because of people like Roy White, who went about their business, they did great work, they played great baseball, and they avoided all the controversy. Willie Randolph in the book, I got a chance to interview Willie Randolph for the book, said that when he came to the Yankees, he learned from Roy White on how to be a dignified, wonderful, good human being on the Yankees. And they had, guys like Chris Chambliss, who I also interviewed for the book. But they all really got their key and their work ethic and the way they handled themselves by watching Roy White. And I argue, whenever I talk about the Roy White and his career, that I don't think the Yankees would have been successful if they didn't have Roy White to set a different standard. If everybody was fighting, that would have been chaos. But Roy White was a guy who was able to bring some normalcy. And you needed that, I think, because that balanced out the other kind of stuff that was obviously getting all the headlines.
Absolutely. Now, 1976, the Yankees end a 12-year drought. They had not won the pennant since 1964. And I believe leading that team in runs that year was Roy White. That was also a year where the Yankees went to the World Series. Unfortunately, they lost, but it set the stage for that great run they'd have all the way up through 1981. Can you talk about Roy and the pivotal role he played with that turnaround with the Yankees, with that 76, starting with that 1976 pennant?
Yeah, in 76, he and Mickey Rivers batted 1-2 in the lineup, and Mickey ran with abandon, and Roy White and Mickey had a special little secret sign, like Mickey would say, "I'm going to steal," or Roy White said, "Go steal." And that Roy White then knew to either hit the ball the other way or hit behind the runner or take the pitch so Mickey could get into scoring position. I think before the season, they said to Thurman Munson, "Hey, let us do our thing, and you'll drive in 100 runs this year because you're going to drive us both in, or we're going to both score 100 runs." I think they basically did. I think Roy White scored like 103 runs and Mickey Rivers might have scored 97, something like that. But they basically scored 200 runs between them. And they were the catalysts at the top of the lineup, the guys who got it all done. And, in 77, he played regularly. In 78, he played a little less regularly. But again, he was a guy who was always a tough out, and he was a tough out in clutch games. You talk about all sorts of games where he hit big home runs, or he got the base hit, or he walked and he scored a run, or he made a great defensive play to help the Yankees secure a victory. And, once you're the established veteran and you're the guy that so many other people look to, again, I believe that even without the numbers, even if you didn't do anything, the way you comport yourself and the way they see how you handle stress and the way you go about your business helps to set that atmosphere for winning.
I look back at those late 70 Yankees teams, the two clutch hitters that immediately come to mind are Lou Piniella and Roy White. It always seemed to be when they needed some kind of base hit, a single, a run driven in, one of those two guys came through. And speaking of 1978, Roy hit the home run that eventually led them to win the American League Championship Series against a very, very good Royals team. And then he hit a home run in the World Series. And that was an incredible World Series because the Yankees lost the first two games. And then Greg Nettles just played like Brooks Robinson at third base in those next games. And they went on to win 4 straight against the Dodgers. And Roy won his second World Championship, which I was so happy for. So he certainly had contributions that were noteworthy through that championship run that will certainly go down in Yankee lore for sure. Little interesting factoid. If you could first tell people what it is, and then just talk about what I'm going to tell you pertaining to it. And first off, the Bucky Dent home run in 1970. You could tell our viewers that. And what's notable about that is that he used a bat of Roy White's. So if you could
That's
talk about that as well.
That's correct. So 78, the Yankees, after winning the World Series in 77, the first half of the year was a disaster. Everybody was getting hurt. They weren't winning. The only constant was Ron Guidry, who went out there every fourth day, I guess, and just won every game, basically. He started the year 13-0, and he had his most remarkable season that year. The Red Sox were the class of the division that year. And the Yankees, basically at the halfway point, were about 14 and a half games out of first place, and it looked like they weren't going to win. Billy Martin got fired. Bob Lemon comes in as the new manager. And all of a sudden, the Yankees start winning. And slowly, they catch the Red Sox over the course of the next couple months. And they end the season in a tie, an exact tie. And then they have to play a one-game playoff to decide who goes to the regular playoffs to play the Royals to find out who goes to the World Series. And that one-game playoff was played in Fenway Park. And during that game, weak hitting Bucky Dent, who probably hit all of 4 or 5 home runs the entire year and wasn't known as a home run hitter, with the Yankees down, hits a big 3-run home run, as I recall. I think Roy White was on base when he hit the home run. And maybe Chris Chambliss too, as I'm thinking back at it. The interesting story about that was Bucky Dent actually hit the home run with Roy White's bat, which had been Mickey Rivers' bat. Roy had talked to Mickey Rivers at one point. Mickey was in a slump or whatever, and he said, you ought to use my bat. I think my bat will work better for you. And so Mickey said, oh, let me try your bat. And Roy White's bat worked better for Mickey Rivers. I think it was a smaller bat, maybe a little bit lighter. And when Bucky Dent came up before he hit the home run, he had a foul ball off his foot and broke his bat. And so Mickey Rivers came out and he handed him his bat. He goes, Bucky, use this one. And Bucky then took that bat and hit the legendary home run.
That's great. One of the cool things about the book is you've got these vignettes throughout the book with various players who played with Roy talking about the relationship with him, Chris Chambliss being one. How did that come about, and how did you decide who to get?
Yeah, that the deciding was very simple. When I wrote the book, as I said to Roy White, it's going to be your book. As we started working, I said to him, I think it would add a lot to the story if we could get some of the people you played with to comment on your career and what you meant to the team and what you meant to them. And he said, I think that'd be a great idea. And so I said, all right, but you're going to have to tell me the guys and make the contact. I'm not going to call them out of the blue. And if I did, they're not going to know who I am, and they probably wouldn't talk to me anyway. So each of the people were people that Roy White recommended that I talk to. And before I reached out to any of them, he reached out to them and said, would you like to be part of my book? They all agreed. And then Roy White gave me their phone numbers. And then I never called any of these people just out of the blue, like, hey, Chris Chambliss, it's Paul, how you doing? And I would send them a text or an email and say, I'm working on Roy White's book. Could we set up a time to talk? And they obviously knew the email or the text was coming, and they were very gracious. These are players that, again, modeled their careers part after the example set by Roy White. And so, and are still, I think that also says something. If you can have people who are your friends for 50, 60 years, 70 years almost, or whatever, that says something about who you are as a person, that people want to spend decades with you and around you. And so they were all of them were only too happy to oblige.
Roy's career ends with the Yankees in the 1970s, but what a career he had as a Yankee. And what's special about him as well is he's the one Yankee player that bridges that transition period from 1965 with the down years through the renaissance of the team and the championships in the late 1970s. But his baseball career doesn't end there. He ends up, first he had played with one of the great home run hitters in baseball history, Mickey Mantle, in the 1960s. And then now he plays in Japan with Sadaharu Oh, one of the great home run hitters of all time in baseball in Japan. Can you talk about his career in Japan and how that all happened?
Sure. So after the 1979 season, he does not re-sign with the Yankees, and he goes and plays winter ball. He didn't play much in 79. He goes to play winter ball to try to prove to himself and maybe other teams that he can still play at a high level, and he could. And the Japanese team, the Tokyo Giants, the Yomiuri Giants, saw him playing, and they offered him a contract, and they said, we'd love you to come play in Japan. And Roy White had always had an interest in Japan and Japanese culture, and it seemed like a great thing to do. And he signed with the Yomiuri Giants, and then for 3 years was a star in Japan. And right, he was such a good player and such a well-rounded player that he was the guy in the lineup who batted behind Sadahara O, arguably the greatest home run hitter ever anywhere. He had over 800 career home runs. That Roy White was the guy who batted behind him. So he batted behind Sadahara O, and he batted behind Mickey Mantle. My favorite, or one of my favorite Roy White Japan stories, was when he got to Japan. It was spring training. It was cold. It was February. And when he got there, the Japanese players, a lot of them deferred to him. You're Roy White. You were a Yankee. You're a world champion. They work out differently in Japan. Like it's a much more physical type of workout than typical spring training in America. And they said to him, you don't have to do the things that we're doing. But Roy White said, I'm part of the team, and I will do the things you're doing. And I think that really helped bridge the gap and had them embrace him as a player, because he didn't pull rank or anything like that. He said, if you have to do it, I'll do it. We're all teammates together. And that also speaks glowingly of Roy White, who he is as a human being and a teammate.
Now, Roy's very unique in terms of an athlete in the standpoint that he's a very cultured man, in the sense that he likes the arts and so forth. And one of the things that he talked about when I heard him speak was that he gained a love for art in Japan, and has this tremendous love to this day for art and culture. Could you talk about that side of Roy White? Because I think it's pretty unique for an athlete.
Yeah, absolutely. Jim Bouton, in his book, Ball 4, which is a great book, talks about something like he liked to read books, and some of the other players who weren't as educated as Jim Bouton always looked at him kind of funny, like, why would you read? But Roy White was one of those guys who read a lot of books. And when you talk to players who played with him at that time, they said, like, wow, like Roy White's well-read. He reads books. He's smart. He would remember Horace Clarke. They were roommates on the road for many years. And instead of going out and partying and doing all sorts of naughty things, they would bring jazz records and a portable record player and listen to jazz records when they weren't at the stadium. But when he got to Japan, he fell in love with a lot of Japanese art. He saw this one artwork. I think it was a horse. And it, art speaks to people in different ways. And when he saw it, it spoke to him, and he said, I have to own that. And after his career, he became an importer of Japanese art. And for a number of years after his career, he owned a gallery called the Roy Sand Gallery in Ridgewood, New Jersey, where he sold Japanese art and I guess traded in it and things like that. But yeah, he's always had an affinity for some of the finer things in life, much more cultured than the typical perception of what a jock might look like or act like.
Now, he also had a career as a front office executive and a coach as well. Mm-hmm. Could you discuss exactly what he did?
Yeah, so when he comes back to America, he comes back to the Yankees. They hire him as a coach. He loves to tell this story about his first year as a coach. He was about the same age as Lou Piniella. Lou Piniella was an active player, and he kept telling Billy Martin, who was the manager, Billy, I can play. Billy's like, no. And he's like, Piniella's still playing. We're the same age. And he tells the story about, I think he was coaching first base at the time, thinking like, I really should be the guy playing. I should really be the guy playing. And the Yankees were playing a game against the Toronto Blue Jays, and Dave Stieb, who's forgotten by many nowadays, but was an exceptional pitcher in the 1980s, was pitching. And he's watching Dave Stieb just mowing the Yankees down, making guys like Dave Winfield look foolish. And he said, at that moment, I said, you know what? I like being a coach. And so he coached on and off and served in a number of different capacities, including being a front office executive, the assistant GM, for decades with the Yankees, and also in the Oakland A's system for a couple of years, and talks glowingly of the effect he had helping players, but never like, look what I did. It was just more, I was able to help this guy and that guy, and this is what I did to help this guy. always really giving the praise to the player for what they were able to do. But you know, when you hear and you sit down with a guy like Roy White, who just understands baseball at a different level, it just opens, or it opened my eyes at least, where he's saying, like, you know, his hands as he came through where they needed to be. And I'm thinking, like, wow, boy, like he can break this down into such a minute detail to understand what it really takes in order to be a great baseball player. And he was able to explain that, obviously, to the players who really benefited under his tutelage.
Jane, we have about 13 minutes left. I did want to allow, in case any of our viewers or participants here wanted to ask any questions. And if you do, if you want to place those in the chat box, that'd be fine. And if not, that's okay. We certainly have more questions to ask Paul, but I did want to offer that up to anyone viewing here. Feel free to put a question in the chat box, and we'll ask that of Paul. I did want to go back a little bit, Paul, to 1973, because that was a very seminal year in Yankee history, because it was kind of an end of an era. Ralph Houck leaves as manager. The team plays its last game in the old Yankee Stadium. And sadly, coming to an end was the careers with the Yankees. The next year, Mel Stottlemyre would be gone. Horace Clarke would be gone. And by like 74, kind of left from those late 60s, early 70s, well, certainly late 60s, not early 70s, but late 60s teams, is just Roy White. And then, of course, a man by the name of George Steinbrenner becomes the owner that year. How did Roy handle that kind of upheaval and change, considering he was basically kind of the only guy left from the late 60s in 1974 on the team?
That's correct. Bobby Mercer was still there for another year or so before he was traded for Bobby Bonds. But then by then, you know, Thurman had been around for a number of years. They picked up Chris Chambliss, I guess, in 74 or so. So I guess in the era you're saying is just before that. But Sparky Lyle came, I guess, in 72. So there were some players who, you know, helped bridge that gap. Some of the older guys, as you're saying, were gone. But I think that's part and parcel of playing baseball, right? Like it's just sort of always evolving. Like your teammates are always moving on. Somebody's coming in, somebody's going out. And I think it's more a testament to a player like Roy White that they can stick around for 15 years and continue to play at a high enough level that the team says, this is a guy we need to have on the team for any number of reasons, when there's always somebody who's itching for your spot, who might be younger, stronger, faster, more athletic, or whatever. So, his best friend, I think, at the time through those years was Thurman Munson. Their lockers were right next to each other. He's also friends with Ron Blomberg or Bloomberg, who, you know, came up in the late. He was, I think, drafted in like 1968 and came up in the early 70s. So there were guys that came through and stuck around. As per the way he always talked and talks with me, Roy White never has a bad word to say. And so when you ask him about George Steinbrenner, he says George wanted to win. And he did. And I think he's eternally grateful for the fact that he got a chance to play on a winner, because George Steinbrenner brought that to the Yankees. He did also say that Ralph Houck was his favorite manager to play for. And so I'm sure he was sad when Ralph Houck went.
And Ron Blomberg, just a little factoid about Ron Blomberg. He was the first ever designated hitter in the history of baseball. And I believe he was the #1 overall pick in the draft when he was drafted by the Yankees.
I think so, yeah.
That I believe he was. You talked before about Roy's defense. You know, what's notable is not only did he not make an error, and you talked about the difficulty about playing left field at Yankee Stadium. In those days, there were a lot of doubleheaders, and there were a lot of day games. So you had to deal with that sun a lot in those days. But what was very unique about Yankee Stadium before the remodel, if you could talk a little bit about this, and Roy had to deal with this, was there were actually monuments on the playing field.
Yes, yeah, Monument Park, which now is sort of buried. I'm not a big fan of how they have Monument Park situated in the new Yankee Stadium. In the remodeled Yankee Stadium, too, it was moved behind the fence when the Yankees moved the fences in. But when those monuments were first enacted or erected at the stadium, they were in play. And so if you hit a ball far enough into center field or Death Valley and left center field, the ball went and it could bounce off the monuments or behind the monuments, and you had to sort of contend with them as you were going for the baseball. So it added a different element that definitely would not be part of the game today.
You talked about how he was so respected by the Yankees, his fellow players, how he was so respected by his fellow players in Japan, but also Roy was very well respected by the competition as well. As you mentioned before, he made 2 All-Star teams. The competition only had great things to say about Roy White as a player and as a person.
Yes, and since we're talking about Monument Park, it gives me an opportunity to say that I think the Yankees, the current Yankees, their owners and their decision makers have done a terrible disservice to Roy White because he's not in Monument Park. And if you look at his lifetime statistics, I think if you look at WAR, which is sort of like the baseline that statisticians look at today, you might be surprised to know that the 11th greatest Yankee by WAR is Roy White. He played more years. He's the only guy who played on the team through the entire decade of the 70s. He was a 2-time World Series winner. You know, we've got talked about a lot of his accomplishments, but he ranks up in the top 10 or 15 in almost every Yankee offensive statistic that there is. And for whatever reason, the Yankees have never acknowledged that by giving him a plaque in Monument Park. And he's well deserving of it, and his statistics are much better, and he played more years than a lot of the guys who are out there. So it's time that the Yankees, Roy White's going to be 80 this December. You know, this is a guy who gave his life to the Yankees. And then again, he was a coach for many years. He was in the front office. And it's time for the Yankees to do the right thing and to recognize Roy White and get him his monument in Monument Park.
I couldn't agree with you more. There's a lot of players who play 15 years, but it's not with the same team. It's with multiple teams. Roy White not only played 15 years with the team, but they were all productive years, consistent greatness year after year after year, sometimes with championship teams, sometimes with down teams. And I think that's the true mark of greatness, when you can play well on any kind of team, and Roy White certainly did that.
Right.
I'm
sorry. I was just going to say in the back of the book, I have an appendix of where Roy White's place among all-time Yankees. He's 11th in WAR by position players, 7th in games, 9th in at-bats, 13th in runs, 11th in hits, 8th in walks, 6th in stolen bases, 8th in times on base, 2nd in sacrifice flies, 14th in total bases, 20th in runs batted in. And for a guy who wasn't a home run hitter, he's still 28th on the Yankee all-time home run list. I mean, if that doesn't say you were an all-time great Yankee, I don't know what does.
Speaking of being an all-time great Yankee, he's also an all-time great person, and that's evidenced by the Roy White Foundation, which he set up, which still goes on to this day. Could you talk a little bit about the Roy White Foundation and the wonderful work that the foundation does?
Right. So Roy White wanted to have a charity. And one of the things, as we said earlier, was he loves to read and he wanted to help kids. And so the Roy White Foundation helps out college students pay for things like their school books, which, as anyone who's ever gone to college knows, that those costs are enormous. And so the Roy White Foundation was designed as a way to help students become successful at school by helping to take care of the most important incidentals, which are their school books. And yes, the Roy White Foundation is still thriving and active, and people can donate to it today by just going online and going to Roy White Foundation. And there's all sorts of information there that they could find out more about it. But if you donate to the Roy White Foundation, you're donating to a program that's directly helping college students and their ability to succeed while they're there.
Paul, you've written several successful books. I wanted to ask you, what's next in line on the authorship side?
I'm actually going in 2 different directions. I have a book coming out in March The title is called 365.2. And as you know, there's 365.2 days in a year. And a marathon is 26.2 miles. And I don't know if you've ever seen those little ovals that say 26.2 that are on the back of somebody's car. I took that little oval and I made it 365.2. Last year, I decided that I'm a runner. I'm going to run the New York City Marathon in, 12 days now. It'll be my 25th marathon. But one of the crazy things I decided to do last year was run every single day for a year. I didn't know if I could do it. And so I did. And that book is really a running book that documents my successful attempt to run every single day for a year. So that comes out in March. And then the book that I'm currently working on has really nothing to do with baseball. It's all about the Battle of Gettysburg. And that's going to take me many months, a lot more longer than it took me to Roy White book, because he's just such a great storyteller and such a great person that, he'd sit down, tell me the stories, and I wrote the book. That was easy. This one's taking a lot of time because there's a lot of research involved, but that should probably, my hope is that we'll see that book somewhere around 2025. It's a unique history of the Battle of Gettysburg that in a way that no one else has ever done.
Wonderful. Well, I have one final question here, and that is, why do you think, he's certainly been a great Yankee, but he's not Mariano Rivera. He's not Derek Jeter, yet he is so beloved to this day by Yankee fans. Why do you think that is, in terms of why he's so beloved as a former Yankee?
Yeah, I think it comes down to really the main thing we've talked about the whole time. He never embarrassed the team. He never embarrassed himself. He played hard. Yankee fans love players who they know are giving it everything they have. Don Mattingly, those types of players. And Roy White was that type of player. And he defined a generation. For a generation of fans, he was, as we said, the constant. And he was a winner. Yankee fans love winners. But again, he was also this great leader who brought normalcy, calmness, respectability to the Yankees, especially in a time when even the players I loved weren't necessarily doing those same things for the franchise.
Well, Dr. Paul Semendinger, want to say thank you so much for taking time to speak with us tonight. We really appreciate it. This was really wonderful. Congratulations on the book. We wish you continued success with it. And again, thank you so much for this evening. We really appreciate it. And I'll turn it back to Jane.
Thank you so much, Paul, for having you come on to talk with us about Roy White. I know my family are Yankee fans, and I don't think I've ever heard them talk about Roy, but maybe I'll have to ask them now.
You ask them, they'll talk about him.
Yeah, we're looking forward maybe to having you come back, maybe about your running book, maybe next year.
I would love to. Sign me up for March. We'll do it.
And thank you, David, for hosting, Paul. It was a great conversation, and so hopefully everybody here enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Good night, everyone.